Intelligence has been collected, the blocks have been moving around, and now we've come to a circumstance where the blocks are actually in adjacent square grids. It can either be an A or B siding in most cases. It's pretty rare you'd see a C on an adjacent square, unless the weather is horrible. That being said, at this point in time, the blocks actually, in most circumstances, need to be deployed upon the tabletop. And the question is, how do you deploy onto the tabletop? I have deployed the figures. This wood block, as you formerly saw, with its officer attached, or on top of, representing a battle mode formation, is now the equivalency of this Prussian brigade deployed into a single grid square. In the back half of the forward square, or actual deployment square, and the frontal half of the square directly behind. This is the deployment zone of this Prussian brigade. Now the key thing to note was that this brigade was in battle mode, indicated by the officer on top of the wood block. Therefore, when I came to deployment, I was allowed to go into any formation I wished in my respective square grid. I could deploy skirmishers in open order, batteries in an unlimbered position, close order infantry, line, column, or square, whichever method or mode I would decide to do. Conversely, for our Austrians, over here, since they were also in battle mode, they were able to deploy their cavalry in column or line or open order, and the batteries are ready to fire. Now contrast this if this happened to be a situation where one of these forces was in strategic mode and did not have the officer figure on top of the block. As you can see by this wood block, there is no Prussian officer on top of it. Therefore, by definition, this force is in strategic march mode and not battle mode. There's a huge difference in the game when it comes to combative capabilities between strategic and battle mode. In battle, you can set up any way you wish. Open order, square, column, line, doesn't make any difference as long as you're in your half of the deployment grid. When it comes to strategic, you are limited to being in a massed column formation. All your guns must be in a limbered state. There's no skirmishers being deployed and no linear formations. In addition to that, each and every unit in your command is automatically placed in strategic morale disorder, and will retain this morale disorder until the player spends a full turn stationary and changes from strategic to battle mode. At the conclusion of that movement phase, all the figures or units in this particular case will automatically regain their morale and be normal good status. This isn't a morale situation, it's just because they're represented as being not locked up for battle. Well, this is actually a very fatal flaw to be in if there's enemy cavalry, like this Austrians in the adjacent square, in a position where they can move forward their full move of 12 inches, practically putting themselves directly in front of this infantry, and then call a following charge. Your army is starting already in morale disorder, so that you're halfway home to rout. So it behooves the players to be very careful when you get squares in adjacency to the enemy, that you be in battle mode. The question will come up during the game when it comes to the deployment of the actual miniatures on the tabletop as to which side or team places their figures on the tabletop first. And the answer is quite simple. It's whoever is the non-phasing player side. And the phasing player is the person who's actually doing the movement in that particular movement phase. So if he moves his block from back here, for example, where we have our senior officers, particularly in this case, and brought it forward to this front square, then the Austrian player, by definition, is the non-phasing player at this point of the game. And therefore he would place his cavalry figures down in whatever formation he's allowed to based upon his block deployment. Then the Prussian player would place his respective figures in his particular block or square. But bear in mind, in the sequence of play, after the Prussian player has finished his movement coming from here to here, you would then go through the normal sequence of play of the mutual artillery, infantry, fire phase, and things of that nature. So the Austrian player may or may not be able to fire based upon the range. But after that, it would then turn to become an Austrian player's movement. So if this player is smart, and this particular brigade happened to be in strategic disorder or something of that nature, he would literally take this cavalry, ride it to where this white sheet of paper is, and call a charge at the beginning of the Prussian following phase. And since he's so close, the odds are he would run over this infantry. He wouldn't have a chance to react. But the key thing is who deploys first. It's the non-phasing player. Basically the player that's not presently moving in that movement phase. And that is universal for all block deployment. So in certain cases during the game, in the movement phase, movement of figures will be halted while the other player is actually placing their figures down. And really all he needs to do is place his forward edge figures, or the front rank shall we say, and then the other player can continue with his movement. He's going to know what's going down, but he knows everything else is behind the front edge. If this Prussian brigade happened to actually be in battle instead of showing his in strategic, he could actually place his figures into squares and lines and things of that nature, because he sees already he's faced by enemy cavalry. While using the block movement system, there could be situations where the actual deployment of the figures is going to be forced upon the table, and the actual player is going to lose any accumulated movement points they've acquired to date. Case in point, we have a Prussian brigade which has been patiently saving up its half movement point while in battle mode to go from this grid square into this woods grid square, which costs a total of 2 movement points to enter, 1.5 for the diagonal plus a half for the woods. He's almost there. He's got one more movement phase to go before he can actually pick up the block and place it into this grid square. Unfortunately, the Austrian player is going to take his brigade and bring it forward in battle into this particular grid square, directly adjacent to the Prussians. And this is going to normally force an actual deployment of the figures on the tabletop. They're certainly within artillery range, charge range, they're basically 12 inches apart. The Austrians would deploy in the back half of this particular square, and the Prussians would have to be forced to deploy in the back half of this square. He does not use the forward deployment rule because A, he didn't call it, and B, there's no terrain, and also he never paid the sufficient amount of movement points to actually enter into that grid square, so no figures would be deployed in this particular grid square either. So in recap, the Austrians would be in the back half of this square, and the Prussians, even though they've saved up all these movement points, would deploy in the back half of this square. So, word to the wise, if you can't actually get into the terrain squares which you're intending to get into, keep in mind you're going to be deployed in the square you're presently residing in. Normally a unit is deployed in the back half of the square, the front half of the square directly behind. But there's a unique rule called forward deployment, which allows the player to place units in the forward half of the square which he's presently residing in, if 4 criteria are met. Number 1, there must be terrain features actually in the forward half or forward grid square. Building, wall, hedges, something physical that the troops or units can hide behind or occupy. If it's a totally open ground field like this, then the forward deployment rule may not be utilized under any circumstance. Number 2, the block must save up a half movement point penny and have it residing on the block to allow the forward deployment. Number 3, your opposite players must be notified that this block is occupying the forward deployment zone. There can be no surprises. If there is no notice given to the opposite players, the rule cannot be utilized. And number 3, the block or command must be in battle mode. No strategic movement or mode units can utilize the forward deployment. One last comment. If during the game there's a discussion as how a block should be deployed or moved or something of that nature using the block movement system, both player sides or teams should discuss the rules, possible outcomes, and come to a logical conclusion. If no logical conclusion can be met, break out a dice and dice off the result. This is commonly done in our gaming group, and it avoids any long-term discussions. We go to the dice immediately if there's any heated discussion of any form. So players are highly encouraged to utilize this method and keep the game moving.